In 2004, deep within the tangled green hollows of West Virginia, a photographer searching for the forgotten faces of America found himself at the end of a dirt road, about to knock on the door of a story that would claw its way into the digital consciousness of the world. His name was Mark Laita, and his project, Created Equal, was an exploration of contrasts in American culture. He'd photographed CEOs and crack addicts, movie stars and the homeless, seeking the threads of shared humanity that bound them. But the people he was about to meet in the tiny, hauntingly named community of Odd, West Virginia, were different. They existed outside of any category he could have conceived. His journey there began not with an invitation, but with a warning. A Raleigh County Sheriff's deputy, upon hearing where Laita was headed, had stopped him, his voice low and serious. He spoke of the family up the holler, the Whitakers. He warned that they were fiercely protective of their isolation, that they didn't take kindly to outsiders, and that previous attempts by strangers to approach them had been met with shotguns. The deputy's words hung in the humid air, a stark premonition. This wasn't just a trip to a rural outpost. It felt like a descent into a forbidden territory, a place shielded from the modern world not just by mountains, but by a dark and complex history. Laita, a man driven by the pursuit of the raw and unfiltered truth, decided to proceed. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to capture an image so profoundly unsettling, it would become a modern legend. A single photograph that would raise 1,000 questions about genetics, poverty, and the secrets that can fester in isolation. The road deteriorated from cracked pavement to gravel, then finally to a muddy track that seemed to be swallowed by the forest. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. And then he saw it. The house, or what was left of it, was a dilapidated shack, barely standing against the encroaching wilderness. A pack of dogs, lean and wary, began to bark, their calls echoing through the trees, a primal alarm system. An old, rusted car sat nearby, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and rust. Smoke curled from a makeshift chimney. It was a scene of profound poverty, but also of something else, something older and more unsettling. As Laita stepped out of his car, the front door creaked open. A man emerged, his eyes holding a mixture of suspicion and a deep, ingrained weariness. This was Whitaker. His movements were agitated, his speech a cascade of guttural sounds and fragmented words that were difficult to parse. But his message was clear. "You're not welcome." Laita, an experienced photographer used to navigating difficult social terrains, tried to de-escalate. He offered to take a simple portrait. It was then that the first truly jarring event occurred. From behind Ray, another family member emerged, and as the confrontation grew more tense, this individual began to bark, not like a dog in anger, but like a human being whose primary form of communication had become a desperate, animalistic sound. Laita was frozen for a moment, the sound cutting through the quiet holler. This was beyond poverty. This was a family locked in a world of their own, with a language and a reality that defied all norms. The warning from the sheriff replayed in his mind, but it was too late. He was here, and the door to this family's world was now, terrifyingly, ajar. The initial hostility slowly, painstakingly, began to recede, replaced by a cautious, childlike curiosity. Laita managed to convey his intentions were not malicious, and gradually more of the family emerged from the shadows of the shack. He met Lorraine, a woman whose eyes seemed fixed on a point in the distance, a silent observer in her own life. He met Timmy, who communicated only in grunts and frantic gestures. And there was Freddie, whose head was cocked at a permanent, severe angle. The physical and cognitive disabilities were immediately, shockingly apparent. Some could not speak, communicating only through the barks and grunts that had first unnerved him. Many had visible facial and skeletal asymmetries. One eye might be pointed straight ahead while the other drifted towards the edge of its socket. Their dental health was, to be gentle, non-existent. Yet, amidst the profound and obvious signs of genetic abnormality, there was an undeniable bond. They moved around each other with a practiced familiarity, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. Laita described the experience as stepping into a scene from the 1972 film Deliverance. The stereotypes of isolated, inbred Appalachian communities were alive in front of him, yet the reality was far more complex and tragic than any work of fiction. He was witnessing the end result of a long, dark biological story, a story written not in ink, but in DNA. The family, he would later learn, was so tightly interwoven that the concepts of uncle, aunt, and cousin had become blurred into a single, repeating genetic loop. The question wasn't just what was wrong with them, but how this could have happened. How could a family line become so entangled that it produced a generation locked in this state? Laita knew he had to capture this moment. It was the entire thesis of his Created Equal project distilled into one haunting tableau. He set up his large format camera, a slow and deliberate process that seemed to calm the family. They watched, intrigued by the strange accordion-like device. He arranged them on a dilapidated porch bench, Ray, Lorraine, Freddie, and Timmy. The air was thick with tension and a strange, quiet dignity. Laita looked through the viewfinder, composing the shot that would become infamous. It was more than a portrait, it was a historical record. Ray, the most verbal of the group, stared directly into the lens, his expression a mixture of defiance and confusion. Lorraine sat beside him, her gaze distant, lost in an internal world no outsider could ever access. Freddie's head was tilted, his body contorted. Timmy looked on with an air of simple curiosity. Click. The shutter opened and closed, capturing the light, the poverty, the pain, and the profound genetic isolation of the Whitaker family in a single frame. In that moment, Laita wasn't just a photographer. He was an archivist of a human tragedy. After taking the shot, he gave them a Polaroid as a gift, a small, tangible piece of the encounter. They were fascinated by the image appearing on the small white square, a moment of simple joy in a life that seemed devoid of it. He packed his equipment, the barks of the dogs following him as he retreated back down the muddy track. He left West Virginia with the photograph, but he also left with a heavy, unshakable feeling. He had documented them, but he had not understood them. And he had no idea that the image he now possessed was a genetic key, capable of unlocking a family history more disturbing than he could ever imagine. For years, the photograph of the Whitakers existed in a state of relative obscurity. It was published in Laita's 2008 book, Created Equal, a stark and unsettling image among many others. To those who saw it, it was a powerful, anonymous portrait of rural poverty and otherness. But the story behind the faces remained locked away in the West Virginia hills. Laita himself moved on to other projects, yet the memory of that day in never fully left him. It was a loose thread in his mind, a question mark hanging over his work. The world, for the most part, remained unaware of Ray, Lorraine, and their family. The digital age, however, has a way of resurrecting ghosts. An image, once released, can take on a life of its own, traveling through forums and social media, gathering context and speculation along the way. The Whitaker portrait was too compelling, too mysterious to remain buried in a photography book. It began to surface online, often without credit or context, presented simply as the most inbred family in America. The questions started to multiply with every share and every comment. Who were these people? Were they real? And if they were, what was the story behind their condition? The single frame Laita had captured in 2004 was acting like a magnet for the darkest curiosities of the internet. The silence from the holler only amplified the mystery. It was a perfect storm of modern folklore, a digital campfire story with a real human face. The photograph was no longer just a document, it was a challenge. It dared the world to look deeper, to uncover the truth of its origins. What was needed was a key, a starting point to trace the twisted branches of this family tree. That key would eventually be found in public records, in the names John and Gracie Whitaker, the parents of the individuals in the photograph. And the records would confirm the first horrifying fact. They were not just husband and wife. They were double first cousins. To understand the story of the Whitakers, one must first understand the world that created them. Appalachia, and particularly the rugged, isolating terrain of southern West Virginia, is a character in this tragedy. For centuries, these mountains have served as both a sanctuary and a prison. Settled by fiercely independent Scots-Irish immigrants in the 18th century, the region fostered a culture of self-reliance and deep suspicion of outsiders. Families carved out lives in narrow valleys and deep hollows, often miles from the nearest neighbor, and even further from the reach of government or law. This geographic isolation was the perfect crucible for a phenomenon known as the founder effect. When a small group of individuals establishes a new population, the gene pool is limited to their DNA. Any rare genetic traits, particularly recessive ones that cause disease, can become disproportionately common in subsequent generations. If those generations continue to intermarry within the same small, isolated community, the chances of two individuals carrying the same recessive gene coming together skyrocket. This wasn't a matter of malicious intent or a lack of morals, but a brutal consequence of geography and circumstance. For generations, the dating pool in these remote hollows was limited to the people you knew, the families you grown up alongside. Cousins marrying cousins was not just common. In many cases, it was a practical necessity. Over time, the family tree, instead of branching out, begins to fold back in on itself, creating a series of genetic feedback loops. Each loop increases the odds of a catastrophic biological outcome. The story of the Whitakers is not an anomaly. It is the extreme, concentrated result of a historical process that has been quietly unfolding in these mountains for over 200 years. The world that Laita stumbled into was not an aberration of the modern world. It was a living relic of the past, preserved in a valley that time and genetic diversity had forgotten. The genealogical records, once unearthed, begin to paint a chillingly clear picture. The parents of Ray, Lorraine, Freddie, and their many siblings were John Isom Whitaker, born in 1897, and Gracie Mee Rader, born in 1916. While their surnames were different, their blood was not. Their fathers were brothers, and their mothers were sisters, making John and Gracie double first cousins. In genetic terms, this is an exceptionally high degree of consanguinity. Siblings share approximately 50% of their DNA. First cousins share about 12.5%. Double first cousins, however, share a much higher percentage, around 25%, genetically equivalent to being half-siblings. When two people with this much shared DNA have children, the genetic lottery becomes a high-stakes game of Russian roulette. Every human carries, on average, a few lethal recessive alleles, genes that, if inherited from both parents, can cause severe disease or disability. For unrelated parents, the chance of both carrying the same rare recessive allele is astronomically low. But for John and Gracie, the chances were dangerously high. They were drawing from the same limited, isolated gene pool. John and Gracie had a staggering 15 children together. Of those 15, a significant number were born with or developed profound physical and mental abnormalities. Some died in infancy, their small bodies unable to overcome the genetic misprints they had inherited. Others, like Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, survived into adulthood, living testaments to the devastating power of compounded recessive genes. The family tree is not a tree at all. It is a wreath, woven together in a tight, repeating circle. And at the center of that circle are John and Gracie, the patriarch and matriarch of a lineage defined by love and biological catastrophe. Their union was the critical event, the moment the family's genetic fate was sealed. To go back another generation is to peel back another layer of this genetic knot. We arrive at John Isom Whitaker's parents, Henry L. Whitaker and Eliza Ann Rader, and Gracie Mee Rader's parents, John R. Rader and Eliza Ann Meadows. Here, the lines begin to cross in a dizzying pattern. Henry Whitaker's brother was John Rader. Eliza Ann Rader's sister was Eliza Ann Meadows. This is the source of the double cousin marriage in the next generation. We are in the late 19th century, a time when southern West Virginia was still a frontier in many ways. The coal boom that would define the state had not yet fully exploded. Life was agrarian, hard, and isolated. Communities were built around family clans, and marriages were often alliances, means of consolidating land and resources within the same small valleys. The idea of marrying out was not just impractical, it was often impossible. The journey to the next county could take days over treacherous mountain terrain. The pool of eligible partners was the handful of families living within a day's walk. This was the social and geographical reality that governed life. For the Whitakers and the Raiders, their world was likely confined to the few square miles of Raleigh County. Their social lives revolved around church, family gatherings, and the shared struggle of subsistence farming. In this context, the marriage of cousins was not seen as a taboo, but as a normal, even expected, part of life. They had no knowledge of Gregor Mendel's laws of inheritance or the dangers of recessive alleles. They knew only the world they could see, a world where the Raider family lived down the creek and the Meadows family lived over the next ridge. The tragic irony is that the very thing that made their community strong, their interconnectedness and reliance on one another, also carried the seeds of its genetic downfall. Pushing the timeline back further into the mid-19th century, post-Civil War Appalachia, the picture becomes murkier, but the pattern of isolation deepens. This was an era of reconstruction for the nation, but for many in the mountains, it was simply a continuation of the same hardscrabble existence they had always known. The great-grandparents of the family Laita photographed were likely born into a world with no electricity, no paved roads, and very little formal education. Their identity was tied not to the United States of America, but to their specific holler, their creek, their family name. The rugged landscape was a formidable barrier. It segmented the population into small, clan-like pockets. A journey that would take an hour by car today could have been an arduous, multi-day trek on foot or by mule. This extreme isolation meant that these pockets of humanity became, in effect, human laboratories for genetic drift. Surnames become a tangled web. In the Whitaker family tree, names like Raider, Meadows, and Mullins appear again and again, weaving in and out of different branches until the branches themselves merge. It's highly probable that if one were to trace the lineage back far enough, they would find that the initial Whitaker and Raider settlers of that specific region were themselves related, establishing a founder effect that was then compounded over and over for more than a century. This isn't a story of a single choice, but of 100 small choices made out of necessity and a lack of alternatives, accumulating over generations. Each marriage of first or second cousins was another turn of the genetic screw, tightening the odds, concentrating the handful of faulty genes carried by the founding members of this isolated clan, until the consequences could no longer be hidden. They would be born into the world, plain for all to see, on a dilapidated porch in Odd, West Virginia. To truly grasp the tragedy of the Whitakers, one must look at the cold, hard science of genetics. Imagine DNA as a vast library of instructional manuals for building a human being. Each manual is a gene. We inherit 2 copies of every manual, one from each parent. Most genetic diseases, especially the type of rare disorders likely affecting the Whitakers, are caused by recessive mutations. This means that to have the disease, you need to inherit 2 faulty copies of the same manual, one from your mother and one from your father. If you only inherit one faulty copy, you are a carrier. You won't have the disease, but you can pass the faulty manual on to your children. In the general population, the manuals containing these dangerous typos are rare. The chances of 2 random people who happen to carry the exact same rare typo meeting and having a child are incredibly slim. But within an inbred family line, everyone is reading from the same small section of the library. If the great-great-grandfather had a rare typo in the manual for, say, brain development, he would pass that manual to his children. They become carriers. If his children then have kids with their cousins, who are also descended from him, the odds of 2 of his grandchildren, both carrying his specific typo, having a child together increase dramatically. When that happens, there is a 1 in 4 chance with each pregnancy that the child will inherit 2 faulty copies. The result is a child born with a genetic disease. Now, imagine this process repeating for 7 generations, with multiple typos in multiple manuals. It's a genetic echo chamber. The same faulty instructions are passed down, amplified, and recombined, until the library is filled with corrupted texts. This can lead to a constellation of issues: craniofacial deformities, intellectual disabilities, skeletal problems, vision and hearing impairments, and congenital heart defects, a checklist of the very ailments observable in the Whitaker family. The phenomenon of royal inbreeding, particularly within the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, serves as a stark historical parallel. For centuries, the Habsburgs, who ruled over a vast empire including Spain and Austria, practiced a policy of strategic intermarriage to consolidate power. Uncles married nieces, and first cousins married first cousins, all to keep royal bloodlines pure and territories within the family. The result was a living gallery of genetic decline. King Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was a tragic endpoint of this policy. His family tree was so convoluted that his father was also his mother's uncle. He suffered from a host of physical and cognitive ailments. He was unable to chew his food properly due to the severe Habsburg jaw, a pronounced underbite that was a family trademark. He didn't speak until he was 4 and couldn't walk until he was 8. He was infertile, and his death without an heir plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. Scientists have since studied his lineage, calculating an inbreeding coefficient that was higher than a child born to a brother and sister. The Whitakers are, in a sense, the Habsburgs of Appalachia, but where the Habsburgs' inbreeding was a deliberate strategy for preserving power and wealth, the Whitakers was a byproduct of geography and poverty. The genetic consequences, however, are strikingly similar. The visible facial asymmetries, the physical deformities, the cognitive impairments, they are the same biological red flags. The Whitakers are a testament to the fact that genetics is the ultimate equalizer. It doesn't care about castles or shacks, crowns or coal dust. The biological laws that brought down a European empire are the same laws that have played out, generation after generation, in a secluded West Virginia holler. As the 20th century dawned, the outside world finally began to breach the Appalachian fortress, but not in a way that fostered diversity. The catalyst was coal. The mountains of West Virginia were found to sit atop some of the richest coal seams in the world, and the boom that followed was explosive and brutal. Coal companies bought up land, established company towns, and recruited labor. One might assume this influx of industry would have broken the isolation of families like the Whitakers. It might have introduced new people, new genes, new possibilities. But in many of the deepest, most remote hollows, the opposite was true. The company towns were often just as insular as the farming communities they replaced. Life was rigidly controlled by the mining company, from the housing to the general store. While new people came to the region, they often settled in these centralized towns, while families who owned their small plots of land further up the creeks, like the Whitakers, remained on the periphery. They may have sent their sons to work in the mines, but their social world remained anchored to the family clan. Furthermore, the coal industry created a new kind of poverty. The work was dangerous. The pay was low, often in company scrip, not real currency. And when the mines went bust, they left behind a devastated economy and a scarred landscape. This cycle of boom and bust deepened the poverty that had always been a feature of the region, making it even harder for young people to leave and find opportunities elsewhere. The world changed around them, but for many in the remote hollows, the fundamental circumstances did not. The roads remained poor, education was limited, and the family was the only safety net. The coal boom, rather than breaking the cycle of inbreeding, may have inadvertently reinforced the conditions that allowed it to continue for another 2 generations. To truly understand the Whitaker family story, one must understand the culture of the holler. A holler or hollow is more than just a geographical feature, a small valley nestled between mountains. It is a social and psychological space. For generations, these hollers were the entire world for the families who lived in them. They were sovereign territories, governed by unwritten rules and fierce loyalty. This fostered a deep-seated and often justified mistrust of outsiders, or flatlanders. Government officials were seen as tax collectors or revenue agents. Doctors and teachers were often viewed with suspicion, their book learning seen as an arrogant dismissal of traditional ways and folk knowledge. This cultural defensiveness became a powerful mechanism for social and genetic isolation. When a census taker or a social worker did venture up a remote holler, they were often met with silence, evasion, or outright hostility. Families learned to conceal their problems, to present a unified front to the outside world. This is the culture that the sheriff's deputy was trying to explain to Mark Laita. The Whitakers weren't just a family. They were part of a clan that had spent centuries perfecting the art of being left alone. This instinct for privacy, born of a history of exploitation and misunderstanding by the outside world, had a tragic side effect. It meant that children with obvious developmental or medical issues were often kept from schools and doctors. The problems were handled in the family. This prevented any outside intervention that might have provided medical care, genetic counseling, or social services. The very cultural shield that protected them from the judgment of the world also locked them into their devastating biological destiny. The holler was a cradle, but it was also a cage. The story of the Whitakers becomes infinitely darker when placed against the backdrop of one of America's most shameful historical chapters, the eugenics movement. In the early 20th century, a pseudoscience took hold among the nation's intellectual and political elite. Eugenicists believed that social problems like poverty, crime, and mental illness were hereditary traits that could be eliminated by controlling human reproduction. They advocated for better breeding among the fit and sought to prevent the unfit from having children. Appalachia, with its high rates of poverty, illiteracy, and its whispered rumors of inbreeding, became a primary target for eugenicists. They saw the mountain people as a degenerate stock, a threat to the nation's genetic purity. Field workers from the Eugenics Record Office were sent into the hills of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee to document family pedigrees, looking for evidence of feeble-mindedness, immorality, and other inherited flaws. Their research was biased and cruel, often labeling entire families as genetically worthless based on little more than poverty and a lack of formal education. This ideology wasn't just academic. It had horrific real-world consequences. More than 30 states passed laws allowing for the compulsory sterilization of individuals deemed unfit. Tens of thousands of Americans were sterilized against their will, many of them poor, disabled, or from minority groups. The Whitaker family, had they come to the attention of the authorities during the height of the eugenics craze, would have been a textbook case for sterilization. They were the very people the movement sought to eliminate from the gene pool. In a deeply disturbing irony, their extreme isolation and mistrust of the outside world, the very factors that caused their genetic problems, may have been the one thing that saved them from the eugenicist's knife. They were hidden from a society that would have sought to erase their bloodline entirely. So the long, winding road of history leads us back to the present, to the dilapidated shack in Odd, West Virginia. We have traced the threads back through time, through the marriage of double first cousins John and Gracie, through the interconnected lives of the Whitakers and Raiders in the 19th century, all the way back to the foundational isolation of the first settlers in these unforgiving mountains. We have seen how geography, culture, and poverty conspired to turn a family tree into a tangled wreath. The science of recessive genetics provides the mechanism, but the history provides the cause. The individuals Mark Laita met in 2004 were not a random accident of nature. They were the culmination of a century-and-a-half-long biological experiment in human isolation. Each generation added another layer of complexity, another turn of the genetic ratchet, until the accumulated mutations expressed themselves in a cascade of physical and neurological disorders. Ray's fragmented speech, Lorraine's silent gaze, Timmy's nonverbal world, Freddie's contorted frame. These are the living echoes of choices made by their ancestors out of necessity and ignorance. They are carrying the genetic burden of their entire lineage. The single photograph Laita took is a time capsule. It contains not just the images of 4 individuals, but the entire, tragic history that produced them. It is a story of love and loyalty within a family, but also a story of a biological trap from which there was no escape. The mystery of how the Whitakers came to be is, for the most part, solved, but a new, more troubling set of questions was about to emerge. 16 years after that first encounter, Mark Laita would return, this time with a video camera, and unleash this quiet family tragedy upon an unsuspecting world. In 2020, 16 years after his first visit, Mark Laita felt a pull to return to Odd. The world had changed dramatically. The internet, which had been a relatively new frontier in 2004, was now the central nervous system of global culture. His photograph of the Whitakers had become a piece of internet lore, a viral ghost story. Laita, now a successful YouTuber with his channel Soft White Underbelly, saw an opportunity. His channel's mission was to interview and document the lives of people on the fringes of society, the addicts, the runaways, the outcasts. The Whitakers were in many ways the ultimate subjects for his work. He wanted to go back and replace the single, static, haunting image with a more nuanced human story. He wanted to give them a voice. But his motivation was complex, a mixture of journalistic curiosity, artistic ambition, and perhaps a sense of unfinished business. He felt a responsibility to the family he had briefly met so long ago. He wanted to see how they were faring, to understand their daily lives beyond the shock of their appearance. This time, he wouldn't just be taking a picture. He would be capturing their reality on video, broadcasting it to millions. The ethical considerations were immense. Was it possible to tell their story without exploiting them? Could a family, some of whom were nonverbal and clearly suffering from severe cognitive impairments, truly give informed consent to become global internet sensations? Laita decided the potential for good, for raising awareness and providing financial help, outweighed the risks. He packed his camera gear and began the long drive back into the Appalachian Mountains, back to the muddy track and the barking dogs, unsure of who or what he would find. Would they even remember him? Or would he be met, once again, with the barrel of a shotgun? The journey back to the Whitaker property was a journey into memory. The landscape was the same, the rolling green hills, the dense forests, the narrow, winding roads. But time had left its mark. The small town seemed a little more weathered, the sense of economic hardship a little more pronounced. As Laita turned onto the familiar dirt road, a sense of trepidation returned. He was no longer a lone photographer on an art project. He was a YouTuber with a massive audience, and he was about to shine a very bright, very public light on this intensely private family. He found the shack just as he had left it, perhaps a bit more dilapidated, sinking a little further into the earth. The rusted car was still there, now almost completely consumed by nature. The dogs, likely a new generation, started their familiar, frantic barking. The scene was eerily unchanged, a pocket of the world immune to the passage of 16 years. He got out of his car, the camera in his hand. The door creaked open. This time he was met not with immediate hostility but with a flicker of recognition. Ray came out, his face older, more deeply lined, but his eyes held the same agitated energy. Laita reintroduced himself, reminding Ray of the photograph he had taken so long ago. It was a tense moment. The family's memory and perception of the past were uncertain. But then another figure emerged, one Laita hadn't met on his first visit. Her name was Betty, a sister. She seemed to be the family's primary caregiver and their link to the outside world. She spoke clearly. She understood who Laita was and why he was there. Her presence changed the entire dynamic. She was the gatekeeper, the interpreter, the one who could grant him permission to enter their world once more. With Betty's cautious approval, Laita was allowed to re-enter the Whitakers' world. He saw Lorraine and Timmy again. They had aged, their bodies frailer, their movements slower. The 16 years had clearly taken a toll. Freddie, he learned, had passed away from a heart condition some time ago, a stark reminder of the family's fragile health. The reunion was a strange mix of the familiar and the new. Ray was still the most vocal, his speech a stream of consciousness mixture of comprehensible words and unintelligible sounds. Laita, more patient this time, began to pick up on the rhythm and patterns of his communication. Lorraine remained almost entirely silent, her presence a powerful, haunting stillness. Timmy still communicated through excited grunts and gestures, his demeanor one of perpetual, childlike innocence. Laita learned that he was the only one in the family who had graduated from high school. Betty became the impromptu guide. She explained the family dynamics, who was who, and what their daily life was like. It was a life of extreme simplicity and routine, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. They had no internet, no cable TV. Their world was the shack, the porch, the yard, and the occasional trip to the store for supplies. Through Betty, a clearer picture began to emerge. The family was not entirely cut off. They had relatives who helped, neighbors who looked out for them. They were known and, in a way, protected by the local community. This added a new layer of complexity to the narrative. They were not feral beings discovered in the wilderness. They were a known, local family with a tragic and visible history, cared for in a way that the outside world might not understand. Laita's camera was now rolling, capturing not just the shock of their existence, but the quiet, mundane, and deeply human moments in between. The first video Laita filmed was a raw, verite-style tour of the Whitakers' home and life. He followed Ray around the property, asking simple questions, allowing the camera to capture the unfiltered reality. The tour was a jarring look at crushing poverty. The inside of the house was cramped, cluttered, and profoundly unsanitary. Animals, including dogs and cats, roamed freely inside and out. The kitchen was rudimentary, the living conditions what most would consider squalid. Yet for the Whitakers it was home. There was an unnerving scene where Laita offered them money for food, and they immediately requested pizza from a specific local shop, a small detail that grounded their extraordinary circumstances in an ordinary, relatable desire. He spoke with Ray about his life, his family. Ray's answers were often disjointed, leaping from one topic to another, but they provided glimpses into his mind. He was aware of his family's reputation. He knew people made fun of them. There was a moment of profound sadness when he seemed to acknowledge their own otherness. Laita then filmed the famous group scene on the couch, where he asked them about their parents, confirming that they knew their mother and father were related. The interaction was awkward and heartbreaking. Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy sat together, a living portrait of genetic decline, trying to answer questions about a history they could not fully comprehend. The barking, the grunting, the long silences, it was all captured on video. Laita knew this footage was explosive. It was far more powerful than a single photograph. It was proof of life, proof of their condition, and it was about to be seen by millions of people who had no context for the history of Appalachia or the science of inbreeding. He had the story. Now he had to decide what to do with it. On July 2, 2020, Mark Laita uploaded a 12-minute video to his Soft White Underbelly channel titled Inbred Family the Whitakers. The effect was instantaneous and seismic. The YouTube algorithm, designed to promote content that elicits strong emotional reactions, seized upon the video and propelled it into the feeds of millions of users worldwide. The view count exploded, climbing into the tens of millions. The comment section became a global town square, a chaotic and often brutal forum for the world to process what it was seeing. The reactions were a firestorm of conflicting human emotions. There was shock and disgust, with many viewers expressing horror at the family's living conditions and appearance. There was crude mockery and cruel jokes, with the Whitakers instantly becoming the subject of morbid memes. But there was also an overwhelming wave of pity and compassion. Viewers expressed heartbreak for the family, seeing them not as monsters but as victims of circumstance, trapped in a cycle of poverty and genetic misfortune. And then there was the anger. A significant portion of the audience turned on Laita himself, accusing him of being a modern-day P.T. Barnum, running a digital freak show. They accused him of exploitation, of dangling these vulnerable individuals in front of a global audience for clicks and ad revenue. The debate raged. Was this documentary journalism, or was it poverty tourism? Was Laita giving a voice to the voiceless, or was he preying on people who could not possibly understand the implications of their newfound fame? The Whitakers, who had lived their entire lives in near-total obscurity, were now one of the most famous and controversial families on the planet. They had no idea the storm that was raging in their name. The ethical debate surrounding the Whitaker videos became as much a part of the story as the family itself. On one side were the fierce critics. They argued that Laita was a poverty vulture, profiting from the misery of others. They pointed to the family's clear cognitive disabilities as evidence that they were incapable of giving informed consent. How could Lorraine, who never speaks, consent to having her image broadcast globally? How could Ray, whose grasp on reality seems tenuous, understand what it means for 30 million people to watch a video about him? Critics argued that Laita was reinforcing harmful stereotypes about Appalachian people, presenting the Whitakers as a spectacle and ignoring the broader socioeconomic issues at play. They saw the act of filming the family in their squalid home as a profound violation of their dignity, regardless of Laita's stated intentions. On the other side were Laita's defenders and Laita himself. He argued that ignoring people like the Whitakers is a form of erasure. His goal, he claimed, was to show the unvarnished truth of the human condition, to force his audience to confront uncomfortable realities. He maintained that he treated the family with respect and that his work was a form of advocacy. By showing their plight, he was making their invisible suffering visible. Furthermore, he argued that the videos were a means to a tangible end, providing direct financial assistance to the family. This point would become central to the ongoing narrative. The dilemma lies at the heart of documentary work. Where is the line between documentation and exploitation? Is it possible to shine a light on a sensitive subject without burning it? The Whitaker saga forced a massive, public conversation about these questions, and there were no easy answers. Faced with the flood of both criticism and concern, Mark Laita made a pivotal move. He established a GoFundMe campaign for the Whitaker family. This action fundamentally shifted the narrative. To his supporters, it was proof of his benevolent intentions. He wasn't just taking their story, he was leveraging his platform to provide material help. To his critics, it was a clever way to deflect accusations of exploitation, a way to legitimize his project by laundering the profits from his views through charity. The response to the GoFundMe was staggering. The same audience that was captivated and horrified by the videos opened their wallets. Donations poured in from around the world, quickly reaching tens of thousands of dollars. The money, managed by Laita and the family's relatives, began to have an immediate and visible impact on the Whitakers' lives. The first major project was to repair their dilapidated house. They were able to afford a new roof, fixing the leaks that had plagued them for years. They bought a new pickup truck to replace their old, unreliable vehicle, a crucial lifeline for trips to the doctor and the grocery store. The funds provided a steady stream of food and essential supplies, improving their quality of life in a direct and measurable way. Laita documented these improvements in subsequent videos, showing his audience the tangible results of their generosity. This created a powerful feedback loop. Watch the videos, feel compassion, donate, and then watch more videos to see the positive impact. It complicated the ethical debate immensely. If the family's living conditions were demonstrably improved by the exposure, did that justify the initial act of putting them on display? It became a real-time experiment in the ethics of viral content and crowdfunding, and the Whitakers were at the center of it all. As Laita made more trips to Odd, a remarkable thing began to happen. The relationship between the filmmaker and his subjects evolved. The initial dynamic of a shocked outsider and a suspicious, isolated family slowly transformed into something more familiar, almost familial. Laita was no longer just a documentarian. He became a benefactor and, in a strange way, a friend. His subsequent videos show this shift clearly. He would arrive not just with cameras, but with gifts, pizzas, sodas, new clothes, and other treats. He learned their individual personalities and quirks. He developed a rapport with Ray, engaging in long, rambling conversations that, while often nonsensical, revealed a deep trust. He would bring coloring books for Lorraine, who would sit quietly, engaged in the simple, calming activity. He discovered that Timmy loved listening to country music. These small moments of human connection stood in stark contrast to the initial, shocking portrait of the family. The audience began to see them not as a monolithic entity of inbreds, but as individuals. They saw Ray's pride in his family, Timmy's simple joy, and Lorraine's quiet grace. Laita's tone in the videos also changed. His initial shock was replaced by a gentle, protective affection. He would gently correct commenters' misconceptions and defend the family against online cruelty. This evolving relationship, however, raised new ethical questions. Was he creating a dependency? By becoming their primary source of financial support and outside contact, was he inadvertently isolating them further from their local community? The line between documenting a life and altering it had been completely erased. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant, a central character in the ongoing story of the Whitaker family. Looking closer at the individuals reveals a more detailed and tragic picture. Ray is the family's self-appointed spokesman and protector. Despite his cognitive challenges and disjointed speech, he possesses a raw, instinctual intelligence. He understands that his family is different, and he is fiercely defensive of them. In the videos, he is the one who interacts most with Laita, the one who tries to articulate their needs and their story. He seems to carry the weight of their legacy, a burden he can feel but not fully comprehend. Lorraine is the enigma. She is almost completely nonverbal, her face a stoic mask that rarely betrays emotion. Her silence is profound, leaving viewers to wonder what thoughts, if any, are occurring behind her distant eyes. Her existence is one of passive observation, a life lived almost entirely internally. Her condition seems to be one of the most severe, a silent testament to the genetic lottery's cruelest outcomes. Timmy represents a different facet of the family's condition. While also largely nonverbal, he is expressive, communicating with an infectious, childlike glee. His fascination with simple things like a new toy or a favorite song provides moments of light in the otherwise dark narrative. His high school graduation is a surprising and poignant detail, a hint of potential that was never fully realized. And then there is Betty, the sister who acts as the bridge to the modern world. She is the family's memory and its advocate. Without her, the story would be nearly impossible to tell. She provides the names, the dates, the context that the others cannot. She lives with the daily reality of their care, a life of immense love and sacrifice. Together, they form a complex, interdependent unit, each playing a role defined by their abilities, each a unique victim of their shared inheritance. The Whitaker family does not exist in a vacuum. One of the most surprising revelations from Laita's follow-up videos was the role of the surrounding community. The initial warning from the sheriff about shotguns painted a picture of a family violently isolated. The reality, as it turned out, was more nuanced. The neighbors and relatives in the immediate area were not hostile, they were protective. They had known the Whitakers their whole lives. They understood their history and their challenges. They looked out for them, checked in on them, and provided help when needed. This protective instinct is what the sheriff was likely describing. The community's attitude towards Laita was one of extreme suspicion. They saw him as another outsider coming to gawk, to exploit their own. They had likely seen it before, journalists or curiosity seekers venturing up the holler, only to leave and write cruel stories. Their protection was a shield against the judgment and mockery of the world. This is a common dynamic in many insular, rural communities. Problems are handled internally. The community will care for its own, but it will also guard its secrets fiercely from those it doesn't trust. Laita's continued presence and the tangible help he provided through the GoFundMe seemed to have slowly earned him a degree of trust. but the initial reaction is telling. The Whitakers were not abandoned outcasts. They were a known and tragic part of the local fabric, a family that the community both sheltered and hid. Their story underscores a profound truth. The world Laita discovered was never truly lost. It was just deliberately and defensively concealed from view. A shadow that looms over the Whitaker story is the stark reality of their mortality. In one of his early return videos, Mark Laita learns that Freddie, the brother with the severe head tilt seen in the original 2004 photograph, had passed away. The cause of death was a heart attack, a common consequence of many genetic syndromes. This news serves as a grim reminder of the physiological cost of the family's heritage. The same genetic mutations that cause their visible deformities and cognitive impairments also wreak havoc on their internal systems. Congenital heart defects, organ abnormalities, and a predisposition to certain cancers are common in cases of extensive inbreeding. The family's lifespan is, by necessity, a shortened one. This fact reframes the entire narrative. We are not just watching a story about a unique way of life. We are watching a story that is, by its very biological nature, coming to an end. The current generation of Whitakers, Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and their siblings, are the final chapter. None of them have had children of their own, bringing this specific, intensely concentrated line of genetic inheritance to its natural and tragic conclusion. Freddie's death was a harbinger of what is to come. The videos are not a timeless portrait. They are a documentation of a family in its twilight years. The joy brought by a new truck or a warm meal is real, but it is temporary. It cannot fix the underlying, irreparable damage written into their DNA. Each new video is a race against time, a documentation of the final members of a lineage that was destined to extinguish itself. From a medical perspective, while no official diagnoses have ever been made public, it is possible to speculate on the conditions affecting the Whitaker family based on observable traits and the principles of genetics. The range of issues suggests not one single disorder, but likely a combination of several autosomal recessive conditions. Many of the family members exhibit craniofacial dysmorphism, abnormalities in the structure of the head and face. This includes hypertelorism, widely spaced eyes, which is visible in several members, and microcephaly, a smaller than normal head, a condition often associated with severe intellectual disability. The skeletal issues, like Freddie's tilted head, likely a congenital neck deformity such as torticollis or Klippel-Feil syndrome, and other joint problems, point to disorders affecting connective tissue or skeletal development. The most significant and pervasive issue is the profound cognitive and developmental impairment. The inability to speak, the reliance on grunts and barks for communication, and the childlike demeanor of even the adult members of the family all point to severe neurological problems. This could be caused by structural brain malformations or metabolic disorders that have impacted brain development and function from birth. The high incidence of heart problems, like the one that killed Freddie, is another classic indicator of a genetic syndrome. It's crucial to understand that these are not separate, unrelated problems. They are all likely different manifestations of the same underlying genetic catastrophe. The Whitaker family is a case study in pleiotropy, where a single faulty gene can have multiple, seemingly unrelated effects on different systems of the body. They are a living, breathing medical textbook of the devastating consequences of generations of inbreeding. The Whitaker story, once unleashed on the internet, quickly transcended the realm of documentary and entered the darker world of memes and modern folklore. Their faces, particularly from the 2004 photograph, became shorthand for inbred, used in countless cruel jokes and shock value posts across social media platforms like Reddit, 4chan, and TikTok. The family was stripped of their humanity and turned into a caricature, a symbol used to mock rural Americans and perpetuate the hillbilly stereotype. This phenomenon highlights the double-edged sword of their viral fame. While it brought them financial aid and a degree of advocacy through Laita, it also subjected them to a level of global ridicule they could never comprehend. They became the unwilling poster children for a taboo subject, their personal tragedy converted into cheap, disposable online content. This process both reinforces and challenges stereotypes. On the one hand, their story seems to confirm the most extreme clichés about Appalachia. On the other hand, for those who watch Laita's videos more deeply, the narrative becomes more complicated. The humanity, the family bond, the quiet dignity of Lorraine, the protective instincts of Ray, these elements defy the simple, monstrous caricature. The audience is forced to confront the real people behind the meme. The Whitaker story, therefore, becomes a litmus test for the viewer's own capacity for empathy. It forces a choice: to engage with the uncomfortable, tragic complexity of their lives, or to retreat into the easy, dehumanizing comfort of a stereotype. For millions, they remain a joke, but for many others, they have become a powerful, unforgettable lesson in the consequences of isolation and the enduring strength of family. The consistent presence of Mark Laita's camera and the resources it brings has undeniably and irrevocably altered the course of the Whitakers' lives. This raises a critical question in line with the observer effect in physics. Does the act of documenting this family fundamentally change the reality being documented? The answer is unequivocally yes. Before Laita's return in 2020, the Whitakers lived in deep poverty. There lives a constant struggle for basic necessities. Now, thanks to the GoFundMe, they have a repaired home, a reliable vehicle, and a steady supply of food. Their material conditions have improved beyond what they could have ever imagined. This intervention, born of the camera's gaze, has likely extended their lives and improved their health. However, this positive change comes with a complex set of consequences. The family has become dependent on Laita and the goodwill of his anonymous online audience. Their survival is now tied to their narrative, to their willingness to be filmed. This creates a subtle but powerful coercive dynamic. Does their participation in the videos stem from a genuine desire to share their story, or from the understanding that cooperation leads to pizza, soda, and a new roof? The camera's influence also extends to their social interactions. Laita is now their most consistent link to the world beyond their holler. While this has brought them kindness and help, it may also have supplanted their reliance on local community and relatives, potentially altering the social fabric that supported them, for better or worse, for decades. The Whitaker story is no longer a pure example of isolated Appalachian life. It is now the story of an isolated Appalachian family that became a global media phenomenon, a new and entirely unprecedented reality. At the very core of the Whitaker saga lies the deeply unsettling question of consent. In documentary filmmaking, informed consent is the ethical bedrock, the principle that subjects must understand the nature of the project, the potential risks and benefits, and freely agree to participate. With the Whitakers, this principle is stretched to its breaking point. Can a person who communicates primarily through grunts and barks truly consent to their life being broadcast to 50 million people? Can an individual with severe cognitive impairments grasp the abstract concept of YouTube, of global fame, of becoming a meme? Betty, the sister, provides a form of proxy consent. She is of sound mind and has agreed to the filming, believing it is in the family's best interest. But is it ethically sound for one family member to consent on behalf of another in matters of such profound public exposure, especially when financial benefit is involved? This is a gray area that challenges the conventions of documentary ethics. Critics argue that Laita is exploiting a loophole, using Betty's consent as a shield to justify filming those who cannot truly speak for themselves. Supporters argue that to deny them the opportunity to have their story told, and to receive the help that comes with it, simply because they cannot articulate consent in a conventional way, would be a different form of paternalism and erasure. There is no clean answer. The situation forces us to question the very definition of consent, autonomy, and who has the right to tell a story. The Whitaker's silence on the matter is, ironically, the loudest and most haunting part of the entire ethical debate. Their inability to say yes or no leaves the audience in a permanent state of moral unease. The future of the Whitaker family is a closed loop. As a genetic lineage, their story ends here. None of John and Gracie's children who suffer from the most severe abnormalities have had children of their own. The biological dead end that was set in motion generations ago has finally been reached. This fact imbues the ongoing documentary project with a profound sense of finality and poignance. We are watching the last members of a unique and tragic family live out their final years. The question then becomes one of legacy. What will the Whitakers leave behind? For the wider world, their legacy is a digital one, a collection of viral videos and a haunting photograph that will forever be associated with the topic of inbreeding. They will be a case study in genetics textbooks, a cautionary tale in sociology classes, and a permanent fixture in the darker corners of internet culture. Their story has forced a global conversation about poverty, isolation, and the ethics of media. But for the family itself, the future is much simpler and more immediate. It is about the day-to-day. It is about having enough food to eat, a warm place to sleep, and the comfort of each other's presence. Thanks to Laita's intervention, their remaining years will likely be more comfortable than their past ones. But the fundamental tragedy remains. The money can fix the roof, but it cannot fix the chromosomes. It can buy food, but it cannot buy back cognitive function or physical health. The future for the remaining Whitakers is a slow, quiet fade, a gradual succumbing to the inevitable biological realities they were born with. Their end will be as private and quiet as their lives were before a camera found its way up their muddy road. In the end, we must return to the land itself. Odd, West Virginia. The name hangs over this story like a cruel cosmic joke, but the place is real. The mountains that surround the Whitaker home are ancient and beautiful, indifferent to the human drama that unfolds in their shadows. For generations, these mountains served as a fortress, protecting the families within from the outside world. This protection allowed a unique culture to flourish, but it also created the perfect conditions for a genetic catastrophe. The mountains were a sanctuary that became a prison. The very landscape that provided them with life and identity also sealed their fate. Driving through Raleigh County today, one can see the paradox of Appalachia. It is a region of breathtaking natural beauty, scarred by deep poverty and a history of exploitation. The hollows are filled with ghosts, the ghosts of coal miners, the ghosts of forgotten families, the ghosts of a way of life that is slowly disappearing. The Whitaker Shack is not an anomaly. It is an echo of that history, a place where the past has refused to die. It stands as a testament to the enduring power of place to shape human destiny. The story of this family could not have happened in the flatlands of Kansas or the suburbs of California. It is a story that belongs to these hills, born from the soil and the silence and the isolation. The mountains will remain long after the last Whitaker has gone, holding their story in the quiet rustle of the leaves and the whisper of the wind through the hollow. We began this journey seeking the truth behind a shocking photograph, a macabre mystery hidden deep in the American backcountry. We delved into genealogical records and the dark history of eugenics, tracing a family's biological fall through 7 generations. We witnessed their reemergence into a world that was at once horrified, fascinated, and, in a strange turn, compassionate. But what have we truly found? The story of the Whitakers is not a simple tale of monsters or a carnival freak show. It is a profoundly human tragedy, a story about the devastating intersection of geography, poverty, and genetics. It forces us to confront our own voyeurism, to question the blurry line between documentation and exploitation, and to look beyond the shocking surface to the complex individuals underneath. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and their family are not a symbol or a meme. They are the last children of a forgotten world, living out the consequences of a history they did not choose. Their story is a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truths about poverty we prefer to ignore and the hidden corners of a country that prides itself on progress. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened to the Whitakers, but what their story says about us, the viewers who watch from the comfort of our screens. What do you believe? Was bringing this family's story to light an act of compassion or an unforgivable act of exploitation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to explore more hidden stories from the dark side of history, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.